And that was the way it was handled. It was addressed. I, it's just not the same. And where do we go from here?
Yeah, that's interesting too. And you know what, I I feel like, and I'm not trying to be a conspiracy theorist. That's not where I'm going. However, I feel like we are. How do I say this? I feel like we're in a scenario now where it's almost being set up for the kinds of changes that need to happen and the kinds of multi-dimensional conversations that need to take place. I almost feel like it's being set up for that not to happen.
For
Because
it
if you think
not to
about it,
happen.
for it not to happen. So I
Okay.
was reading an article and it was talking about this Nichols situation, and they're talking about it from a trauma
Mm-hmm.
standpoint, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in the article, they're saying the real problem is that we're being desensitized to
Mm-hmm.
Black Death. So there are, and there's two sides to that coin. There's what we're seeing with all of these different videos, and it's just happening so rapidly now, and it's just seemingly so casual, right? And then you have people that are getting off, they're not being held accountable for what's happening. And then the other side is it's also glorified. So if you think about some of the movies we watch and some of the TV shows that are some of our favorite TV shows, right? And so it's almost like there's this holistic effort, and I'm doing that in air quotes, to put people in a position where this is normalized. So I don't even know that it's so much about trauma as much as it is about desensitizing, however you say that word, desensitizing. That's what the article was saying. So
I don't.
and and that we're seeing that play out in our neighborhoods, right? Because you're talking about growing up in a neighborhood where you policed yourselves, where everybody looked out for everybody, where there was a parents club. Now, where is that happening these days, right? Now to a scenario where, again, to use your words, where your neighbor is actually your enemy. So now instead of looking out for the person that's next to you, you're actually trying to protect yourself from that person. And rightfully so, because that person may very well be the person who you need to protect yourself from. The neighborhood I grew up in West Baltimore, we watched somebody who lived in the same block as us rob somebody else who lived in the same block as us. So now you have that mentality where you're like, okay, it's like that. Got you. And so it's a where do we go from here kind of thing, man. And here's what I this is an answer that a lot of people are they probably won't like, but the participants, go back to that word, as a participant, you who are listening to this conversation, you have a decision to make. That decision hinges on the outcome that you want to see in your family, because you talked about it begins with the family. So the outcome you want to see in your family, that outcome then becomes rippled into your community, your neighborhood, your community becomes rippled into the local society, becomes rippled into your regional society, and on and on and on and on. But it starts with everybody making a decision around what kind of participant they want to be. Now, is that going to change the world? Because you have these folks who the pushback is going to be, well, you're saying something that's never going to take place. And it's not about whether you change the world globally, it's about whether you change yourself. because the societal fabric is made up of individual fibers. You are one of those fibers. So I think that it just rests on us now to be like, okay, what are we going to do as individuals? And then how many of us who make that decision now are going to be willing to come together to stand for something that creates something a little bit more foundational to build off of? Because if not, here's what's going to happen. And this is not doom and gloom, but I'm just being realistic. If not, what is the other side? And are you cool with the other side? Because the other side is these things continue to happen. We continue to have the same conversations. We continue to show the same level of anger. We continue to have the same conversations around race and around trauma and around the desensitizing of death and all of that kind of stuff. And then we calm down. And then it happens again. And we go back to where we were. Like at some point, somebody's got to be like, okay, this cycle isn't really conducive to us moving forward.
Yeah, it's personal ownership. Mm-hmm. Personal ownership. And it's where I think we're not being taught personal ownership or responsibility. And, you know, it really goes back to something you said earlier, and that was, you know, if we're not going to be responsible or accountable to ourselves, to our community, we're going to, and here's the thing, it's going to get worse. It's not going to get better. It's not even going to stay the same. It's going to get worse. You know, it's at what point will we take the experience and say, we've been down this street before, and it's getting worse and worse. It's turning out to be worse than the time before.
Yeah.
But yet we've got to do something different. We've got, each and every one of us, we've got to do something different. And if we are not willing to do that different thing for ourselves, nobody's going to be willing to reach out to you. And I don't know if we talked about this in a previous episode, but when we acknowledge the fact that I have what you need and you need what I have, I see value in you.
Right.
I just have to appreciate that value. And right now we're unwilling to even acknowledge that someone else has value.
Yeah, it's a tough one, man. It's a tough one because in light of this, right? Because this conversation can go a lot of different directions. In light of this Tyree Nichols thing, man, just I don't know, man. We got to figure out how we get to a place where we can have these interactions between law enforcement and individuals, citizens, that we can have these interactions, and these interactions take place in a way that allows everybody to feel safe, even in the event that when you get to a scenario, it is defined in such a way that may cause you to act. Like, and I don't know the answer to that question, right? Because I've never been in law enforcement, so I can't even speak to what it feels like to get to a scenario and realize that it's defined in such a way that this could go left, if not handled properly.
That's the thing that the average citizen doesn't understand.
Mm-hmm.
Each time, they respond
Mm-hmm.
to whomever, whatever. It's not, and to be honest with you, an officer who goes to any event thinking that it's going to be simple is the
Mm-hmm.
ones that probably don't come home.
Interesting. Okay.
The ones that probably don't come home. There is no, I mean, that just is not. And then be honest with you, now I was never a police officer. I worked in evidence. We
Mm-hmm. Okay.
worked in evidence and I did stuff like that. But I interacted with these guys, these women, these officers.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I understand what they're going up against because I had the opportunity to look at the bird's eye view of it.
Okay.
I was the guy who was actually looking at that event from what they call the bird's nest.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I did. So I mean, we capsulated video. We recovered video and stuff like that in all cases. And I could see how, based on from the time the call was sent out to the time that that event was completed, everything that goes involved with that. I mean, from the adrenaline to the completion. I mean, it is a remarkable how you, in a moment's notice, you go from 1 to 100
Mm-hmm.
in just no time.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden you are expected to just drop off. Just stop. Because, a good example, and I'll bring this up. You saw the last play of the Kansas City Cincinnati game.
No, I missed it, but I did hear about it.
About where old boy pushed Mahomes out of bounds, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And people just don't get it. Here you are chasing this guy. You chasing this guy. You chasing this guy. And then all of a sudden, he runs out of bounds. Right when you get there,
Mm-hmm.
he runs out of bounds. And yet you're supposed to stop.
Hmm.
That's the scenario when you're running, you're chasing, you're fighting, you're trying to get to him, and then all of a sudden you run out of bounds, and I'm supposed to stop.
Mm-hmm.
Just on a dime, I'm just supposed to stop. If nothing else, your momentum is going to carry you into this guy, irrespective as to where you are and the boundaries.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you think, because I'm gonna play devil's advocate,
Go right ahead.
do you think, based on that, right? Because here's what some will say, right? Because if I remember the scenario correctly, Nichols he was stopped, right, for reckless driving, I believe, and he ran. Now I don't remember what ensued that made him run, but he ran. Um. So the pushback would be, now, is the momentum, because obviously there's probably some level of adrenaline. So going back to what you talked about, defining the moment, right? You get to what you think the definition is, which is a traffic stop. The person runs. Now you're redefining it on the fly. You chase. In that redefinition, maybe is some adrenaline, is some other things going on, is some, maybe some preconceived notion of what this kind of definition leads to, all that kind of stuff, right?
And ego.
And ego. And ego. That's good. Wow. That's good. And ego. Catching him now. Is there a moment where you could stop on a dime?
Actually, I'm gonna even throw another little something in this. Was the stop justifiable?
That's the next thing.
See,
That's
see that see, because see now that starts this whole process of getting things started. There's a multitude of levels. Remember, I told you from the call, from the time of the call,
Mhm.
because when a police responds to any person or situation, they're supposed to radio in that they're making that they're making the stop. Okay, so they're basically having to justify their reasoning for doing this.
Mhm.
They're going to record this. This is I'm going to let somebody know that this is what I'm doing. Was that justifiable? See, that's where we're getting into the first factors when we use race as the issue here. We started talking about, was that justifiable? Should they need it? Did they even need to stop them? Were they profiling?
Mhm.
Okay, in this situation, you can't go that one. Okay, not at least at that level anyway.
Mhm.
But it still, was it a justifiable? Now, listening to the police chief, that's where they started and found to be unjustifiable at that point.
Got you. Okay.
So anything that happened
After that,
after that
right. That's
was mute.
escalation.
They were down. They was just getting caught on camera at that point.
Yeah, which then now speaks to it's so many levels to this, right? Because now that speaks to what you just said, ego, right? Because here's the thing. I'm thinking in my mind, I'm like, the fact that you know that what you're doing is being recorded and you do it anyway speaks to a whole nother, that's a whole, like, that scenario alone will derail this conversation into a whole
That's
conversation.
that's the culture.
Got you.
That's the culture. That's the conversation that people need to have, and not this. That race thing was a cover up. The issue, it doesn't matter what color the uniform, who's in the uniform. It's what the culture, what is a permissible in this culture. Because here's the point: these guys, that ain't the first person they did to. This first person they got caught doing it to.
Mhm.
This ain't unusual for them. It's a presentation that you want people to in the community, it's a little ego in there,
Yeah.
for a traffic stop, to drag him out of the car for a traffic stop.
Mhm. You're right. It does speak to the culture because that just reminds me of the story with the Baltimore gun trace task force. And with a lot of those guys, it was ego. Like they could get away with it. They knew they could get away with it. They knew they could get away with robbing drug dealers and you know, doing their level of gang banging. Basically, they knew they could get away with it, and nobody was going to say anything.
And here's the point: who you gonna believe?
Exactly. Yeah, you're right. That brings it full circle to because that's where you started. You started with culture. That's how you started this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Because that's the part. That's the conversation nobody's having.
Mhm.
We're asking them to do something and then having to try to regulate it on such a difficult. You were talking about this balancing act.
Mhm.
You're asking them to do the impossible, and they're human beings. They're human beings. You're trying to act like you can be a robot and do. You can't do that. You want me to chase you and hold your hand at the same time?
Yeah, that's you know what? I'd like to one day have this conversation with we haven't had any guests yet, but it would be interesting to actually have some law enforcement because that's interesting, right? Because protect and serve. Again, going back to the video I saw where somebody's like, man, they're not even doing that anymore. So the definition of what's expected to, you're expected to do something that has no definition behind it.
Well, it has a definition, but it's a very gray definition.
Okay.
It's you're asking me to do something, like I said, to chase you and hold your hand at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a easy course to navigate as being that person who's having to do that. You know, it's
And
just not simple.
psychologically, is that possible?
That's the issue. That's the question. That's the question. You know, because you talk about hiring the right person
mm-hmm.
in the law enforcement, and yet what does that look like? Because there is no way. It's sort of like going into the military. You don't know what you're going to end up seeing until you come back from it, and then all of a sudden it is what it is. The traumatic experience, the PTSD is real. But if you ain't never been there, how do you relate to it? How do you qualify somebody to be able to go watch people get killed, to kill people on a regular? What does that mindset look like?
That's a good point. That's a good point. And then we've created, from a culture standpoint, I feel like in some instances, a culture has been created that actually upholds the fact that you don't have to balance.
Nobody's balancing.
Right. So it's one thing to get in a situation where it's difficult to balance. And maybe you slip up here and there, or if you want to call it a slip up, based on the fact that you just can't navigate that balance. It's another thing to be like, okay, this level of imbalance is actually what we want, what we expect from you. So if I think about like the Baltimore Gun Trace Task Force, the guy who was training them was like, hey, this is how we do it. That's a whole nother ball game. To be like, hey, this level of imbalance is how we operate. That's a whole nother story.
As a matter of fact, I know I've met the chief of police from Baltimore. He retired a few years ago. I don't know, you probably know him. I can't remember his name, Renee. I'm gonna reach out to him.
Mm-hmm. That'll be a good conversation.
But I'd really like to see if we can get some community people on here to give some ideas, get some idea, because he's really a Baltimore guy. I mean, he lives now in Delaware, I think, but he was a police chief in Baltimore City, he knows what it's about and how to navigate it. But he knows also that I think that there's challenges for law enforcement. And I think the best thing for the community is to understand that they're asked to do something extremely difficult. There's no other occupation quite like it that requires you to have such a psychological experience that can go from left to right at any moment.
Yeah, that's interesting. I would say, like, there's no end to this conversation. Let's just be clear. So for those of you who are listening, I hope we didn't disappoint you in that, you're not walking away with a solution, except for this. I would say this: what needs to happen on both sides of the coin. So there are some significant things that need to be addressed in the culture, to use your word, of law enforcement. There are some significant things that need to be addressed within the fabric of the community. The question is, can we independently do that? Because often one person is like, well, they need to do that. And if they do this, this, and this, then we'll be able to do this, this, and this. And everybody can argue that on both sides. So law enforcement can be like, well, if these people did this or didn't do this or whatever the case is, then we would feel safer or whatever the case. I'm speculating. But at the end of the day, there are some things that need to be addressed on both sides of this, because some of this can be avoided.
I think what you said earlier is that the way it's going to be avoided, though, is that you were talking about the fact that it's like it's being set up to fail.
Mm-hmm.
It's easier, that opinion is easier to manifest than it is to change.
Agreed.
So that statement that you're saying is that, we've got to do something different. And that might be entails a whole lot of things that are different than what we currently see as the norm.
Yeah.
Right now. I think there's a lot of things personally. I think the roles of policing needs to be redefined.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that it's not necessary, but it needs to be redefined. It's not that catch all for every situation. And I think there's a lot of cities that are dealing with that and
Mm-hmm.
saying, okay, if we're looking at mental illnesses, that's not what the police officers will do. They don't do mental. That's a shift that they shouldn't have to be able to have to maneuver at any given time. That you've got to make sure that if we want to be servants, then we should be able to, that window of servant and versus enforcing shouldn't be this big. It shouldn't be as wide as what it is right now. Let's fix this parameter that they operate in, that it's within mental capacity that wouldn't require you to go so extreme, and that momentum carries you across the out of bounds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's what I think, that needs to be redefined. Yeah. That being said,
yeah,
this has been one of those conversations.
Yeah, indeed, and it's ongoing. And hopefully for those that are listening, hopefully it sparks some really intriguing conversations in your own spaces, because I think a lot of us, like I said, there's some individual things we need to do as well, and having these conversations in a way that on the backside of them comes a decision to be accountable, to be cognizant of your contribution and your responsibility to humanity, will help to further move this thing maybe in a direction that is one of healing and introspective thought that leads to some concrete action.
Cool. All right, so we're gonna wrap this up. So Oliver, let them know how they can reach you.
You can reach me if you're a social media person. You can either look up my name, Oliver Marcelle, and follow me that way, or you can look up Denali LLC, DENOLI LLC, on all social media. You can email me, my first name, Oliver @denali.org. Author, speaker, coach, author of the book Overcoming the Man Laws. So get with me. I want to help make your relationship be the one of your dreams, both personally and professionally.
Cool. And I'm Juan Lee. I'm an author and a speaker, also a transformational speaker, and also a thought leader in the power of love. I'm also the founder of a nonprofit called Clear Journey, where we support military veterans and their families in financial literacy, mental health, and self-improvement. And you can reach me at either of those locations at info@Juan Lee the author, or you can reach me at info@clearjourney.org. And until next time, I tell you, we all have to realize that every moment is just a part of life. It's what we have to deal with every day. So understand that it's just life. It's life, what we're doing. Next time. Have a great one. Talk to you then.